History of Egypt, Chaldea, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, by Gaston Maspero, Honorable Doctor of Civil Laws and Fellow of Queen's College, Oxford, Member of the Institute and Professor at the College of France. Edited by A. H. Sayce, Professor of Assyriology, Oxford. Translated by M. L. McClure, Member of the Committee of the Egypt Exploration Fund. Editor's Preface. Professor Maspero does not need to be introduced to us. His name is well known in England and America as that of one of the chief masters of Egyptian science, as well as of ancient Oriental history and archaeology. Alike as a philologist, a historian, and an archaeologist, he occupies a foremost place in the annals of modern knowledge and research. He possesses that quick apprehension and fertility of resource without which the decipherment of ancient texts is impossible, and he also possesses a sympathy with the past and a power of realizing it which are indispensable if we would picture it aright. His intimate acquaintance with Egypt and its literature, and the opportunities of discovery afforded him by his position for several years as director of the Bulaq Museum, give him an unique claim to speak with authority on the history of the valley of the Nile. In the present work he has been prodigal of his abundant stores of learning and knowledge, and it may therefore be regarded as the most complete account of ancient Egypt that has ever yet been published. In the case of Babylonia and Assyria he no longer, it is true, speaks at first hand. But he has thoroughly studied the latest and best authorities on the subject, and has weighted their statements with the judgment which comes from an exhaustive acquaintance with the similar department of knowledge. Naturally, in progressive studies like those of Egyptology and Assyriology, a good many theories and conclusions must be tentative and provisional only. Discovery crowds so quickly on discovery that the truth of today is often apt to be modified or amplified by the truth of tomorrow. A single fresh fact may throw a wholly new and unexpected light upon the results we have already gained, and cause them to assume a somewhat changed aspect. But this is what must happen in all sciences in which there is a healthy growth, and archaeological science is no exception to the rule. The spelling of ancient Egyptian proper names adopted by Professor Maspero will perhaps seem strange to many. But it must be remembered that all our attempts to represent the pronunciation of ancient Egyptian words can be approximate only. We can never ascertain with certainty how they were actually sounded. All that can be done is to determine what pronunciation was assigned to them in the Greek period, and to work backwards from this, so far as it is possible, to more remote ages. This is what Professor Maspero has done, and it must be no slight satisfaction to him to find that, on the whole, his system of transliteration is confirmed by the cuneiform tablets of Tel el Amarna. The difficulties attaching to the spelling of Assyrian names are different from those which beset our attempts to reproduce, even approximately, the names of ancient Egypt. The cuneiform system of writing was syllabic, each character denoting a syllable, so that we know what were the vowels in a proper name as well as the consonants. Moreover, the pronunciation of the consonants resembled that of the Hebrew consonants, the transliteration of which has long since become conventional. When, therefore, an Assyrian or Babylonian name is written phonetically, its correct transliteration is not often a matter of question. But unfortunately, the names are not always written phonetically. The cuneiform script was an inheritance from the non-Semitic predecessors of the Semites in Babylonia, and in this script the characters represented words as well as sounds. Not unfrequently the Semitic Assyrians continued to write a name in the old Sumerian way, instead of spelling it phonetically, the result being that we do not know how it was pronounced in their own language. The name of the Chaldean Noab, for instance, is written with two characters which ideographically signify the sun, or day of life, and of the first of which the Sumerian values were Ut, Babar, Kis, Tarn, and Par, while the second had the value of Z. Were it not that the Chaldean historian Berassos writes the name Xisuthros, we should have no clue to its Semitic pronunciation. Professor Maspero's learning and indefatigable industry are well known to me, but I confess I was not prepared for the exhaustive acquaintance he shows with Assyriological literature. Nothing seems to have escaped his notice. papers and books just published, and half-forgotten articles in obscure periodicals which appeared years ago, have all alike been used and quoted by him. Naturally, however, there are some points on which I should be inclined to differ from the conclusions he draws, or to which he has been led by other Assyriologists. Without being an Assyriologist himself, it was impossible for him to be acquainted with that portion of the evidence on certain disputed questions which is only to be found in still unpublished or untranslated inscriptions. There are 2 points which it seem to me of sufficient importance to justify my expression of dissent from his views. These are the geographical situation of the land of Magan, and the historical character of the annals of Sargon of Akkad. The evidence about Magan is very clear. Magan is usually associated with the country of Melukhach, the Salt Desert, and in every text in which its geographical position is indicated, it is placed in the immediate vicinity of Egypt. Thus Assurbanipal, after stating that he had gone to the lands of Magan and Melukhach, goes on to say that he directed his road to Egypt and Cush, and then describes the first of his Egyptian campaigns. Similar testimony is borne by Esarhaddon. The latter king tells us that after quitting Egypt he directed his road to the land of Melukhach, a desert region in which there were no rivers, and which extended to the city of Rapik, the modern Rapia, at the edge of the Wadi of Egypt, the present Wadi el-Arish. After this he received camels from the king of the Arabs, and made his way to the land and city of Magan. The Tel El Amarna tablets enable us to carry the record back to the 15th century BC. In certain of the tablets, now as Berlin, Winkler and Abel, 42 and 45, the Phoenician governor of the Pharaoh asks that help should be sent him from Melukhach and Egypt. The king should hear the words of his servant, and send 10 men of the country of Melukhach, and 20 men of the country of Egypt, to defend the city of Gebel for the king. And again, I have sent to Pharaoh, literally the great house, a garrison of men from the country of Melukhach, and the king has just dispatched a garrison from the country of Melukhach. At a still earlier date we have indications that Melukhach and Magan denoted the same region of the world. In an old Babylonian geographical list which belongs to the early days of Chaldean history, Magan is described as the country of bronze, and Melukhach as the country of the Samdu, or Malachite. It was this list which originally led Opert, Lenormand, and myself independently to the conviction that Magan was to be looked for in the Sinaitic Peninsula. Magan included, however, the Midian of Scripture, and the city of Magan, called Makan in Semitic Assyrian, is probably the Machna of classical geography, now represented by the ruins of Mukna. As I have always maintained the historical character of the annals of Sargon of Akkad, long before recent discoveries led Professor Hilprecht and others to adopt the same view, it is as well to state why I consider them worthy of credit. In themselves the annals contain nothing improbable. Indeed, what might seem the most unlikely portion of them, that which describes the extension of Sargon's empire to the shores of the Mediterranean, has been confirmed by the progress of research. Amisatana, a king of the first dynasty of Babylon, about 2200 BC, calls himself king of the country of the Amorites, and the Tel El Amarna tablets have revealed to us how deep and long-lasting Babylonian influence must have been throughout Western Asia. Moreover, the vase described by Professor Maspero in the present work proves that the expedition of Naram Sin against Magan was an historical reality, and such an expedition was only possible if the land of the Amorites, the Syria and Palestine of later days, had been secured in the rear. But what chiefly led me to the belief that the annals are a document contemporaneous with the events narrated in them are 2 facts which do not seem to have been sufficiently considered. On the one side, while the annals of Sargon are given in full, those of his son Naram Sin break off abruptly in the early part of his reign. I see no explanation of this, except that they were composed while Naram Sin was still on the throne. On the other side, the campaigns of the 2 monarchs are coupled with the astrological phenomenon on which the success of the campaigns was supposed to depend. We know that the Babylonians were given to the practice and study of astrology from the earliest days of their history. We know also that even in the time of the later Assyrian monarchy, it was still customary for the general in the field to be accompanied by the Asipu, or prophet, the Ashap of Daniel 2:10, on whose interpretation of the signs of heaven the movements of the army are dependent, and in the infancy of Chaldean history we should accordingly expect to find the astrological sign recorded, along with the event with which it was bound up. At a subsequent period the sign and the event were separated from one another in literature, and had the Annals of Sargon been a later compilation, in their case also the separation would assuredly have been made. That on the contrary the Annals have the form which they could have assumed and ought to have assumed only at the beginning of contemporaneous Babylonian history, is to me a strong testimony in favor of their genuineness. It may be added that Babylonian sea cylinders have been found in Cyprus, one of which is of the age of Sargon of Akkad, its style and workmanship being the same as that of the cylinder figured in Volume 3, page 96, while the other, though of later date, belonged to a person who describes himself as the servant of the deified Naram Sin. Such cylinders may, of course, have been brought to the island in later times, but when we remember that a characteristic object of prehistoric Cypriot art is an imitation of the seal cylinder of Chaldea, their discovery cannot be wholly an accident. Professor Maspero has brought his facts up to so recent a date that there is very little to add to what he has written. Since his manuscript was in type, however, a few additions have been made to our Assyriological knowledge. A fresh examination of the Babylonian dynastic tablet has led Professor Delitzsch to make some alterations in the published account of what Professor Maspero calls the Ninth Dynasty. According to Professor Delitzsch, the number of kings composing the dynasty is stated on the tablet to be 21, and not 31 as was formerly read, and the number of lost lines exactly corresponds with this figure. The first of the kings reigned 36 years, and he had a predecessor belonging to the previous dynasty, whose name has been lost. There would consequently have been 2 Elamite usurpers instead of 1. I would further draw attention to an interesting text, published by Mr. Strong in the Babylonian and Oriental Record, which I believe to contain the name of a king who belonged to the legendary dynasties of Chaldea. This is Samas-Natsir, who is coupled with Sargon of Akkad and other early monarchs in one of the lists. The legend, if I interpret it rightly, states that Elam shall be altogether given to Samas-Natsir, and the same prince is further described as building Nippur and Dur-Ilu, as king of Babylon, and as conqueror both of a certain Baldaka and of Kumbasatir, the king of the cedar forest. It will be remembered that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Kumbaba is also stated to have been the lord of the cedar forest. But of new discoveries and facts there is a constant supply, and it is impossible for the historian to keep pace with them. Even while the sheets of his work are passing through the press, the excavator, the explorer, and the decipherer are adding to our previous stores of knowledge. In Egypt, Mr. de Morgan's unwearied energy has raised, as it were, out of the ground, at Kom Ombo, a vast and splendidly preserved temple of whose existence we had hardly dreamed. He has discovered 12th dynasty jewelry at Dashur of the most exquisite workmanship, and at Mir and Asuit has found in tombs of the 6th dynasty painted models of the trades and professions of the day, as well as fighting battalions of soldiers, which for freshness and lifelike reality contrast favorably with the models which come from India today. In Babylonia, the American expedition, under Mr. Haynes, has at Niffer unearthed monuments of older date than those of Sargon of Akkad. Nor must I forget to mention the lotiform column found by Mr. de Morgan in a tomb of the Old Empire at Abusir, or the interesting discovery made by Mr. Arthur Evans of seals and other objects from the prehistoric sites of Crete and other parts of the Aegean, inscribed with hieroglyphic characters which reveal a new system of writing that must at one time have existed by the side of the Hittite hieroglyphs, and may have had its origin in the influence exercised by Egypt on the peoples of the Mediterranean in the age of the 12th dynasty. In volumes 4, 5, and 6 we find ourselves in the full light of an advanced culture. The nations of the ancient East are no longer each pursuing an isolated existence, and separately developing the seeds of civilization and culture on the banks of the Euphrates and the Nile. Asia and Africa have met in mortal combat. Babylonia has carried its empire to the frontiers of Egypt, and Egypt itself has been held in bondage by the Hyksos strangers from Asia. In return, Egypt has driven back the wave of invasion to the borders of Mesopotamia, has substituted an empire of its own in Syria for that of the Babylonians, and has forced the Babylonian king to treat with its pharaoh on equal terms. In the track of war and diplomacy have come trade and commerce. Western Asia is covered with roads, along which the merchant and the courier travel incessantly, and the whole civilized world of the Orient is knit together in a common literary culture and common commercial interests. The age of isolation has thus been succeeded by an age of intercourse, partly military and antagonistic, partly literary and peaceful. Professor Maspero paints for us this age of intercourse, describes its rise in character, its decline and fall. For the unity of Eastern civilization was again shattered. The Hittites descended from the ranges of the Taurus upon the Egyptian province of northern Syria, and cut off the Semites of the west from those of the east. The Israelites poured over the Jordan out of Edom and Moab, and took possession of Canaan, while Babylonia itself, for so many centuries the ruling power of the Oriental world, had to make way for its upstart rival Assyria. The old imperial powers were exhausted and played out, and it needed time before the new forces which were to take their place could acquire sufficient strength for their work. As usual, Professor Maspero has been careful to embody in his history the very latest discoveries and information. Notice, it will be found, has been taken even of the stela of Meneptah, recently disinterred by Professor Petri, on which the name of the Israelites is engraved. At Elephantine I found, a short time since, on a granite boulder, an inscription of Khufu Anka, whose sarcophagus of red granite is one of the most beautiful objects in the Giza Museum, which carries back the history of the island to the age of the pyramid builders of the 4th dynasty. The boulder was subsequently concealed under the southern side of the city wall, and as fragments of inscribed papyrus coeval with the 6th dynasty have been discovered in the immediate neighborhood, on one of which mention is made of this domain of Pepi II, it would seem that the town of Elephantine must have been founded between the period of the 4th dynasty and that of the 6th. Manetho is therefore justified in making the 5th and 6th dynasties of Elephantine origin. It is in Babylonia, however, that the most startling discoveries have been made. At Tello, Monsieur de Sarsac has found a library of more than 30,000 tablets, all neatly arranged, piled in order one on the other, and belonging to the age of Judea, BC 2700. Many more tablets of an early date have been unearthed at Abu Habba, Sippara, and Jaka, Isin, by Dr. Schiel, working for the Turkish government. But the most important finds have been at Niffer, the ancient Nippur in northern Babylonia, where the American expedition has brought to a close its long work of systematic excavation. Here Mr. Haynes has dug down to the very foundations of the great temple of El-Lil, and the chief historical results of his labors have been published by Professor Hilprecht in the Babylonian Expedition of the University of Pennsylvania, Volume 1, 1896. About midway between the summit and the bottom of the mound, Mr. Hayes laid bare a pavement constructed of huge bricks stamped with the names of Sargon of Akkad and his son Naram Sin. He found also the ancient wall of the city, which had been built by Naram Sin, 13.7 meters wide. The debris of ruined buildings which lies below the pavement of Sargon is as much as 9.25 meters in depth, while that above it, the topmost stratum of which brings us down to the Christian era, is only 11 meters in height. We may form some idea from this of the enormous age to which the history of Babylonian culture and writing reaches back. In fact, Professor Hilprecht quotes with approval Mr. Haynes's words, "We must cease to apply the adjective earliest to the time of Sargon, or to any age or epoch within 1,000 years of his advanced civilization." The golden age of Babylonian history seems to include the reign of Sargon and of Ur-Gur. Many of the inscriptions which belong to this remote age of human culture have been published by Professor Hilprecht. Among them is a long inscription, in 132 lines, engraved on multitudes of large stone vases presented to the temple of El-Lil by a certain Lugal-Zagizi. Lugal-Zagizi was the son of Ukus, the patisi or high priest of the land of the bow, as Mesopotamia, with its Bedouin inhabitants, was called. He not only conquered Babylonia, then known as Kengi, the land of canals and reeds, but founded an empire which extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This was centuries before Sargon of Akkad followed in his footsteps. Erech became the capital of Lugal-Zagizi's empire, and doubtless received at this time its Sumerian title of the city par excellence. For a long while previously there had been war between Babylonia and the land of the bow, whose rulers seem to have established themselves in the city of Kis. At one time we find the Babylonian prince En-Sag-Sag-Ana capturing Kis and its king. At another time it is a king of Kis who makes offerings to the god of Nippur, in gratitude for his victories. To this period belongs the famous Stela of the Vultures, found at Tello, on which is depicted the victory of E-Dingur-Anajin, the king of Lagos, Tello, over the Semitic hordes of the land of the bow. It may be noted that the recent discoveries have shown how correct Professor Maspero has been in assigning the kings of Lagos to a period earlier than that of Sargon of Akkad. Professor Hilprecht would place E-Dingur-Anajin after the Lugal-Zagizi, and sees in the Stela of the Vultures a monument of the revenge taken by the Sumerian rulers of Lagos for the conquest of the country by the inhabitants of the north. But it is equally possible that it marks the successful reaction of Chaldea against the power established by Lugal-Zagizi. However this may be, the dynasty of Lagos, to which Professor Hilprecht has added a new king, End-Kagil, reigned in peace for some time, and belonged to the same age as the first dynasty of Ur. This was founded by a certain Lugal-Kignub-Nidudu, whose inscriptions have been found at Nifur. The dynasty which arose at Ur in later days, circa BC 2700, under Ur-Gur and Bungi, which has hitherto been known as the first dynasty of Ur, is thus dethroned from its position, and becomes the second. The succeeding dynasty, which also made Ur its capital, and whose kings, Ein-Sin, Pur-Sin-Il, and Gimel-Sin, were the immediate predecessors of the first dynasty of Babylon, to which Karn-Marabi belonged, must henceforth be termed the third. Among the latest acquisitions from Tello are the seals of the Patizi, Lugal-Usumgal, which finally remove all doubts as to the identity of Sargani, king of the city, with the famous Sargon of Akkad. The historical accuracy of Sargon's annals, moreover, have been fully vindicated. Not only have the American excavators found the contemporary monuments of him and his son Naram Sin, but also tablets dated in the years of his campaigns against the land of the Amorites. In short, Sargon of Akkad, so lately spoken of as a half-mythical personage, has now emerged into the full glare of authentic history. That the native chronologist had sufficient material for reconstructing the past history of their country is also now clear. The early Babylonian contract tablets are dated by events which officially distinguished the several years of a king's reign, and tablets have been discovered compiled at the close of a reign which gave year by year the events which thus characterized them. One of these tablets, for example, from the excavations at Nifur, begins with the words 1. The year when Parsin II becomes king. 2. The year when Parsin the king conquers Urbilum, and ends with the year when Gimel-Sin becomes king of Ur, and conquers the land of Zabsali in the Lebanon. Of special interest to the biblical students are the discoveries made by Mr. Pinches among some of the Babylonian tablets which have recently been acquired by the British Museum. 4 of them relate to no less a personage than Kudur-Lag-Hamar, or Chedor-Laomer, king of Elam, as well as to Eri-Aku, or Arioch, king of Larsa, and his son Dermach-Ilani.